You have exactly 1 hour to pack your pathetic bags and get out of my house. Those words hit me harder than a physical blow. The heavy thud of my vintage leather suitcase smashing against the hallway floor echoed through the silent house. It was not just any floor. It was custom hand-planed oak. I had spent 3 grueling weeks on my hands and knees 30 years ago, carefully laying every single plank of that wood, while my late wife Martha brought me iced tea and wiped the sweat from my brow. Now that same beautiful wood was being deeply gouged by the metal corners of the luggage my own flesh and blood had just violently hurled down the stairs. My name is Rick. I am 70 years old, a retired construction contractor who spent his life working 60-hour weeks so his family would never know the meaning of the word hunger. Until today, I thought I had a family. I thought I had a son who respected me. If you are watching this, take a very deep breath. What I am about to share with you is the kind of cold-blooded betrayal you pray never happens under your own roof. Before I continue, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth. It helps to know I am not speaking into the void. How did I end up here standing in my own foyer like a trespasser? Let me give you the bitter context. Just last year, while I was still drowning in the heavy grief of losing Martha to a sudden heart attack, my son Derek came to me with a proposal. Derek is a financial broker. He wears $1,000 suits, drives a luxury German car, and talks with the kind of fast-paced confidence that makes you believe every word he says. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the very table I built for his mother, and placed a thick stack of legal documents in front of me. He looked me right in the eye, wearing a mask of perfect loving concern, and told me we needed to protect my legacy. He insisted that if I did not sign the deed of this $2.5 million Denver property over to him, the government would take a massive chunk of it in estate taxes when I passed away. He said he was doing it to secure my future. He promised I would live in this house until my final day. I was exhausted, still grieving the love of my life, and I trusted my boy. I signed the paper. That single signature was the biggest mistake of my 70 years on this earth. Now looking at Derek standing at the top of the stairs, his face flushed with a terrifying, unrecognizable rage, I realized how thoroughly I had been played. He did not look like my son anymore. He looked like a stranger consumed by greed. "Did you hear me?" Old man Derek yelled, his voice cracking with a toxic mix of panic and malice. "I want you out. Today. Right now." I stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase, my heart pounding a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs. "Derek," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the violent storm inside me. "This is my home. You promised me." A cold, high-pitched laugh interrupted me. Brooke, my daughter-in-law, stepped out from the shadows of the upstairs hallway and wrapped her arms around Derek. Brooke was a woman who calculated the value of everything and the worth of nothing. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating, and entirely devoid of empathy. She looked down at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "It was your home, Rick," Brooke corrected, emphasizing the past tense with cruel delight. "Now it is our property. And frankly, you are ruining the aesthetic. We have important guests arriving tonight, and we cannot have you shuffling around in your dusty old sweaters, making everyone uncomfortable." I could not process the absolute lack of humanity in her voice. I looked back at Derek, silently begging him to intervene, to remember who I was, to tell his wife to stop. But Derek just nodded in agreement, refusing to meet my eyes. He walked heavily down the stairs, aggressively grabbing an old faded winter coat from the hall closet. He shoved it hard into my chest, forcing me to stumble backward toward the heavy front door. "Get out," Derek hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Do not make me call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Trespassing. In the house I built with my bare hands, the house where I taught him how to walk. The sheer audacity of his threat knocked the wind out of me. I realized in that fraction of a second that arguing was entirely useless. There was no love left in this room, only pure, unfiltered greed. I slowly put on the heavy coat, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a rising, freezing anger. I picked up the battered suitcase from the floor, feeling the heavy weight of my entire life reduced to a few sets of clothes and some old photographs. I opened the front door. The brutal wind of a Denver winter afternoon hit my face like a sheet of solid ice. Snow was already piling up heavily on the porch. Before I could take a single step out, Brooke walked up behind Derek. She reached into her expensive designer purse, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and tossed it onto the floorboards right at my heavy work boots. "Take the bus," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "And do not freeze on my driveway. The salt stains are impossible to get out of the concrete." The heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. The metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the freezing air. I was completely alone. The temperature was dropping fast, and the dark gray sky promised a heavy blizzard. I stood on the snow-covered porch for a long moment, staring blindly at the brass door handle I had polished for decades. I bent down slowly, my old joints aching deeply in the cold, and picked up the crumpled $5 bill. I stuffed it deep into the pocket of my coat. As my freezing fingers dug into the deep lining, they brushed against something hard and plastic. I pulled it out. It was a faded blue debit card. Martha account card. It had been expired for a long time, but she always kept it in this coat for emergencies, and I had never been able to bring myself to throw it away after she died. My stomach gave a loud, hollow rumble. I had not eaten since breakfast, and the bitter cold was quickly seeping into my bones. The nearest bank was only 4 blocks away. I figured I could walk there, get out of the freezing snow, and pray that maybe, just maybe, there were a few dollars left in Martha's old account. Enough to buy a hot cup of coffee and figure out my next move. I pulled my thick collar up against the biting wind and began to walk down the icy sidewalk, leaving my 30 years of memories behind. I had absolutely no idea that walking into that bank was exactly what Derek wanted. I had no idea that I was walking straight into a massive federal trap. Every step away from that house felt like dragging 100 pounds of lead chained to my ankles. The Denver wind did not just blow. It howled, cutting through the worn fabric of my old coat like jagged knives. Snowflakes the size of quarters whipped across my face, stinging my cheeks and blinding my vision. I kept my head down, staring at my heavy leather work boots as they crunched into the rapidly accumulating snow. Left foot. Right foot. Breathe. That was the only rhythm keeping me moving. My lungs burned with the icy air, but the pain in my chest was nothing compared to the crushing weight of what had just happened. My son. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle in that very driveway. He threw me into a blizzard like a bag of garbage. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, trying to preserve whatever body heat I had left. My right fingers brushed against the crumpled $5 bill Brooke had tossed at me. $5. 30 years of sweat, 30 years of broken fingernails and aching joints to build a $2 million legacy, and my daughter-in-law evaluated my severance package at $5. I let go of the paper money as if it were coated in poison and wrapped my numb fingers around the piece of plastic in my left pocket. Martha blue debit card. Just touching it brought a sudden painful rush of memories. I could almost see her standing in the kitchen laughing as she slid this card into my coat before I left for work. "Keep it for emergencies," she would say, her eyes crinkling. "You never know when you might need a hot cup of coffee." Martha had always been my safety net. She was the warmth that kept the cold world at bay. When she died suddenly 2 years ago, a massive piece of my soul died with her. I kept the card because it felt like she was still looking out for me. As I trudged through the relentless snow, the bitter reality set in. The card was expired. It had been inactive for over 24 months. The chances of it working were slim, but I had nothing else. I was just an old man with no phone and no real destination. The storm was getting worse. The afternoon sky darkened into a thick, oppressive charcoal. My knees, worn down from decades of kneeling on concrete, throbbed with a dull ache. I needed shelter. I needed to sit down before my legs gave out. Through the swirling white curtain of the blizzard, I saw the glowing green neon sign of the bank on the corner of the avenue. The light blurred in my watering eyes, but it looked like a beacon of salvation. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors, and a wave of glorious artificial heat washed over my freezing face. The sudden change in temperature made my skin tingle painfully. I stood in the vestibule, stomping my snow-covered boots on the black mat and brushing the thick white flakes from my shoulders. The bank was quiet, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. It was near closing time, and the polished marble floor was empty. Gentle, instrumental music played softly from the hidden ceiling speakers. It felt like a completely different universe. I took a deep breath and walked toward the teller counters. My reflection in the dark glass partition caught my attention. I looked like a broken old vagrant. My face was pale and drawn, my eyes red and hollow. I straightened my back, pulling whatever dignity I had left around me like a shield. I might be homeless, I might be betrayed, but I was still Rick Alden. I would not cower. There was only one teller available. He looked like a college kid, maybe 22 years old, wearing a crisp white shirt and a blue tie. His name tag read Tyler. He was typing something on his keyboard, looking thoroughly bored, counting down the minutes until he could go home. I stepped up to his window. "Hello, sir," Tyler said, not looking up right away. "How can I help you today?" I slowly pulled my freezing hand from my pocket and placed the faded debit card on the smooth marble counter. "I need to check the balance on this account, please. And if there is anything left, I would like to withdraw it." Tyler finally looked up. He took one glance at my weather-beaten face, my soaked coat, and the old card. A flash of pity crossed his eyes, making my jaw tighten. He picked up the card. "Let me see what we have here," he said, his voice polite but indifferent. He swiped the card through the heavy black card reader attached to his keyboard. Nothing happened for a second. Tyler frowned slightly and swiped it again, a little faster this time. The machine emitted a sharp, aggressive beep. It was not the soft chime of a successful transaction. It was a loud, jarring noise that cut right through the normally quiet hum of the bank. Tyler stared at his computer monitor. His fingers stopped hovering over the keyboard. I watched as the boredom completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by sheer panic. All the color drained from his youthful cheeks, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. His eyes widened, reflecting a flashing red light from his screen. He swallowed hard, blinking his eyes nervously. Sir Tyler stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Sir, please wait. Look at this." He did not turn the screen toward me. Instead, I saw his right hand slowly drop below the counter out of sight. I knew exactly what was under there. The silent alarm. I stood there, freezing, completely unaware that my nightmare had not ended at the front door of my house. It had only just begun. I watched Tyler's right hand disappear beneath the polished marble counter. My decades in construction had taught me people to spot the micro-expressions of a subcontractor, about to lie, about a cracked foundation, or a delayed shipment. But the look on this young teller face was not deceit. It was absolute, unadulterated terror. He brought his hand back up, his fingers trembling so violently that they tapped against the keyboard like castanets. The aggressive beeping from his terminal had stopped, replaced by a low, continuous warning tone that seemed to vibrate through the thick glass separating us. I leaned closer to the counter, my wet boots squeaking slightly against the quiet floor. "Is there a problem with the account?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. I assumed it was simply closed or overdrawn. After all, Martha had been gone for 2 years. A frozen account was to be expected. Tyler did not answer immediately. His eyes darted from the glaring monitor to my face, then toward the heavy wooden doors of the bank manager office, situated at the far end of the lobby. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working nervously above his tight blue tie. The red light from his screen bathed his pale skin in a sinister glow. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming 18-wheeler. "I just need a moment, sir," Tyler whispered, his voice cracking. "The system is just running a routine security check." I knew a lie when I heard one. You do not hit the silent alarm for a routine security check. The air in the bank suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The soft instrumental music playing from the ceiling speakers now seemed eerie, a sharp contrast to the silent panic unfolding behind the teller glass. I could hear the hum of the HVAC system, the faint rustle of papers from a desk in the corner, and the rapid, shallow breathing of the young man standing in front of me. I glanced over my shoulder. The bank was still completely empty. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, throwing thick sheets of snow against the large front windows. The sky had turned a dark, bruised purple. I was trapped between a freezing storm outside and a bizarre, escalating situation inside. "Listen, son," I said, leaning my forearms on the cold marble. "I am just an old man trying to get enough cash for a cup of coffee. If the card is dead, just tell me. You can cut it up and I will be on my way." "There is no need for any of this." Tyler shook his head rapidly, his eyes wide and pleading. "No, you do not understand," he breathed out, his hands fluttering nervously over his keyboard. He typed a quick, frantic sequence of keys, a small receipt printer beside his monitor whirred to life. It did not print a standard balance slip. It spat out a long, dense piece of paper covered in alphanumeric codes and what looked like federal warning stamps. Tyler ripped the paper from the machine. He looked terrified to even hold it. He glanced toward the manager office again, then leaned forward until his face was inches from the glass partition. He slid the piece of paper under the small metal slot. "Sir, please hurry." "Look at this," Tyler stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. I reached down and picked up the paper. My eyesight was not what it used to be, but the bold black letters at the top were impossible to miss. They were not bank codes. They were government acronyms. IRS, FBI, Department of Homeland Security. Below that was my own name, Richard Alden, linked directly to Martha Old account number. Next to my name was a string of financial figures that made absolutely no sense. Millions of dollars. Foreign wire transfers. Cayman Island routing numbers. My brain ground to a halt. This had to be a mistake. A massive, catastrophic computer glitch. Martha was a retired school teacher. I built houses. We paid our taxes on time every single year. We never had more than a few $1,000s in our savings account at any given time. This piece of paper was accusing me of moving millions in offshore funds. Before I could even open my mouth to demand an explanation, the heavy mahogany door of the branch manager office flew open with a loud, violent bang. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp gray suit stormed out. His face was flushed with adrenaline. He wore rimless glasses and had the aggressive, rigid posture of a military officer rather than a bank executive. He did not walk toward me. He marched. His hard leather shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor, completely shattering the quiet atmosphere of the lobby. Mr. Alden, the manager, barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I turned toward him, the mysterious piece of paper still clutched in my freezing hand. "Yes," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. "What is going on here?" The manager did not answer my question. He closed the distance between us in a matter of seconds. He completely bypassed the teller counter, stepping right into my personal space. Up close, I could smell the sharp scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour odor of nervous sweat. He looked at me not like a customer, but like a dangerous criminal. "There is a highly sensitive issue regarding this account," the manager said, his tone clipped and deeply threatening. "We need to speak right now. I am not going anywhere at all until someone explains this printout," I fired back. The manager did not argue. He suddenly lunged forward. His large hand clamped tightly around my right arm. He yanked me off balance. Using his full body weight, he forcefully pulled me away from the teller counter and dragged me straight into a dark, windowless back office. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut behind us with a definitive, echoing thud. The sudden silence of the windowless office was suffocating, broken only by the sharp, metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The branch manager released my arm and took 2 steps back, putting the solid oak expanse of his desk between us. His chest heaved as he smoothed the lapels of his gray suit, glaring at me as if I were a ticking time bomb. I rubbed my aching bicep, my breathing shallow and fast. I demanded to know what he thought he was doing laying hands on an old man. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to explain himself before I walked out that door and pressed charges for assault. The manager let out a dry, humorless laugh. He walked over to his computer monitor, his fingers dancing rapidly across the keyboard. He told me I was not walking out of anywhere. He said he had a legal obligation under federal law to detain me until the authorities arrived. Detain me for what? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of cold exhaustion and rising terror. I held up the printout the young teller had slipped to me. I told him this piece of paper was a mistake. I am a retired contractor, I said. I do not even know how to set up a foreign bank account. The manager leaned over his desk, his rimless glasses catching the harsh fluorescent light of the ceiling. He pointed a rigid finger at the document in my hand. He told me that piece of paper was not a mistake. He explained that the moment I tried to use my late wife's debit card, I tripped a massive silent alarm that had been placed on my file by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The card was supposed to be inactive, but someone had recently linked it as a secondary recovery method for an offshore shell corporation. A corporation that dealt exclusively in unregulated cryptocurrency. And that corporation, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, was registered under my name and my social security number. I stared at him, my mind spinning violently. I told him that was impossible. The manager shook his head, his expression utterly devoid of sympathy. He said the federal government did not think it was impossible. According to the database, my supposed cryptocurrency firm had laundered hundreds of millions of dollars over the past 18 months, completely avoiding domestic oversight. The IRS was currently hunting down $6 million in unpaid federal taxes directly tied to my identity. $6 million. The number hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The room seemed to tilt. I reached out and grabbed the back of a leather guest chair to steady myself. My legs felt like they were turning to water. I had worked my entire life to build a comfortable nest egg, and my entire net worth at its peak was barely a fraction of that tax debt. I did not have $6 million. I did not even know what cryptocurrency was. You have been flagged as a high-level flight risk, the manager stated, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. The local police dispatch confirmed they are exactly 3 minutes away. They are sending 3 squad cars to secure the perimeter. Once they take you into custody, federal marshals will assume jurisdiction. You are looking at decades in federal prison for tax evasion and international wire fraud. I stood there, in the stifling heat of the back office, the snow melting off my old boots and forming a dark puddle on the carpet. And then, like a lightning strike illuminating a pitch-black landscape, the horrific truth finally dawned on me. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening force. Derek. My son. He was a financial broker. He knew the banking systems inside and out. He knew how to hide money, how to set up dummy corporations, and how to forge signatures. I remembered the thick stack of legal documents he had made me sign last year, under the guise of avoiding estate taxes. I had signed my name dozens of times that day, completely trusting the boy I had raised. He had not just stolen my house. He had stolen my entire identity to build his criminal empire. Suddenly, the events of the past hour took on a terrifying new meaning. Derek did not just kick me out of my home because he was greedy. He kicked me out because he knew the federal investigators were closing in on his shell company. He needed a scapegoat. He needed the man whose name was on all the fraudulent paperwork to look incredibly guilty. And what looks more guilty than an old man fleeing his home with a suitcase wandering the streets and trying to access a frozen bank account linked to an offshore slush fund? He threw me out into the blizzard with absolutely nothing, knowing I would panic, knowing I would run, and knowing I would eventually get caught holding the bag for his $6 million debt. He had meticulously orchestrated my destruction so he could walk away completely clean. I could hear the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens cutting through the howling wind outside. The sound grew louder by the second, rapidly approaching the bank. I looked at the manager, who watched me with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just caught a criminal mastermind. The sirens wailed louder, echoing through the snowy streets. I realized with absolute chilling certainty that if I stayed in this room and let the police put those steel handcuffs on my wrists, my life was entirely over. No one would believe a confused old contractor over the mountain of fabricated digital evidence my son had built. I had to escape this bank right now. I looked at the manager, who was leaning casually against his desk, confident that he had me cornered. He had his arms crossed, a smug smile on his lips as the sirens grew louder outside. He thought I was just a helpless old man. But he forgot I spent 40 years building commercial structures exactly like this bank. I knew every wire, every load-bearing wall, and every flaw in modern electronic security systems. The door was secured by a standard magnetic strike plate. It was designed to keep people out, but it had a fatal weakness on the inside. I took a slow breath, forcing my racing heart to steady. I needed a distraction. I pointed toward his computer monitor, widening my eyes in feigned horror. "Look at the screen," I yelled, putting panic into my voice. "The account balance is draining. It is transferring right now." The manager's smug expression vanished instantly. His fear of losing millions overrode his common sense. He spun around, leaning over the keyboard to look at the blank screen. That was the only opening I needed. I lunged toward the door. My old muscles screamed, but adrenaline is a powerful fuel. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed my thumb into the emergency egress button below the lock frame. The magnetic seal broke with a sharp click. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the hallway. "Hey, stop right there!" the manager bellowed, scrambling around his desk. I did not run immediately. I pulled a wooden wedge from the pocket of my coat. It was a doorstop I carried from my days on the job site. I slammed the door shut and kicked the wedge under the bottom gap. The manager hit the door from the inside, a second later, the wood shuddering. But the wedge held fast, completely jamming the door against the frame. He was trapped in his own office. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, heading deeper into the bank. I knew the layout of these buildings. A branch this size always had a rear loading dock designed for discreet exits. I pushed through double doors marked for authorized personnel only. My boots pounded against the floor. The sirens were deafening now, echoing off the surrounding buildings. I reached the back corridor just as I heard the front doors crash open. Deep, authoritative voices echoed through the lobby, shouting commands. The police had arrived. I threw my weight against the steel push bar of the rear exit. The door swung open, and the freezing wind of the blizzard hit me like a physical wall. I stumbled onto the loading platform and let the metal door close silently behind me. Red and blue lights flashed across the falling snow, casting eerie shadows against the brick walls of the alley. 2 police cruisers had already blocked the front entrance, and I could hear the crunch of tires as a third car sped around the block. I jumped down from the loading dock, my bad knees sending a shockwave of pain up my spine. I scrambled behind a massive green dumpster just as the third cruiser slid into the alley. Its high beams swept across the snow, missing me by mere inches. I pressed my back against the freezing brick wall, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The cruiser idled for a terrifying moment before the officer stepped out, his hand resting on his weapon. He walked toward the loading dock, shining a bright flashlight around the area. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the officer would not look behind the dumpster. The freezing wind masked the sound of my ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the officer turned and jogged toward the front of the building. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was out of the bank, but I was far from safe. The brutal reality crashed down on me with the weight of an avalanche. I was standing in a dark alley in the middle of a massive winter storm. I reached into my pockets, confirming the devastating truth. I had no wallet. I had no identification. I did not have a single dollar to my name. My son had completely erased my life, turning me into a federal fugitive. If the police found me, I would spend the rest of my days rotting in a concrete cell. I needed a plan, but my brain was numb from the biting cold. I began to walk blindly down the alley, hugging the shadows, letting the swirling snow cover my tracks. Every shadow looked like an officer. Every gust of wind sounded like a siren. I walked for 3 agonizing blocks, my feet growing heavier with every step. My face was completely numb, and exhaustion was beginning to take hold of my mind. I knew if I sat down to rest, I would simply freeze to death. Then, through the blinding whiteout, I spotted a faint yellow light glowing near the back entrance of a dilapidated laundromat. It was an ancient, rusted payphone clinging to the brick wall. It felt like a miracle, but a payphone required coins, and I had nothing. Desperation drove me to my knees. I crawled toward a nearby trash can that had been knocked over by the wind. I frantically dug through freezing wet coffee cups and discarded food wrappers, my bare hands scraping against the frozen pavement. My fingers brushed against something small and hard. A quarter. Then a dime. Another quarter. They were sticky and covered in freezing grime, but they were the most beautiful things I had ever seen. I clutched the coins in my shaking fist and pulled myself up to the payphone. I lifted the receiver, dropping the coins into the slot. The dial tone buzzed loudly in my ear. I did not call the police. I did not call a lawyer. I punched in the only number I knew. I pressed the cold plastic receiver to my ear, listening to the monotonous ringing on the other end of the line. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. My teeth chattered so violently that I had to bite down hard on my bottom lip just to keep my jaw steady. I was a desperate man, standing in the freezing snow, holding on to the faint, foolish hope that maybe I had entirely misunderstood the horrific situation at the bank. Maybe there was a logical explanation for the millions of dollars, the shell company, and the federal warrants attached to my name. But the logical part of my brain, the part that had spent decades calculating complex structural loads and identifying fatal flaws in building foundations, knew much better. I knew I was about to hear a meticulously crafted lie. I just needed to hear exactly how he would deliver it to his own father. "Hello," Derek answered on the 4th ring. His voice was incredibly smooth, betraying absolutely no surprise or concern. It was the polished, professional tone he always used when closing a lucrative real estate deal. "Derek Hutchison." I gasped, forcing every ounce of genuine terror and confusion I was feeling into my voice. "Derek, you have to help me right now. I went to the bank to use your mother-old card because I was starving. The machine went crazy." The branch manager dragged me into a dark back room. He locked the door. He said the police were coming to arrest me. He said I owe $6 million to the IRS for some foreign cryptocurrency company. I let out a ragged, trembling breath, playing the part of the confused, frightened old man to absolute perfection. I ran, Derek. I panicked, and I ran out the back door like a criminal. I am hiding in an alley, and I do not know what to do. There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. I expected him to sound shocked. I expected him to demand to know where I was, so he could rush over and protect me. Instead, he let out a soft, incredibly reassuring sigh. "Dad, listen to me," Derek said, his voice dripping with an artificial calmness that chilled me more than the blizzard raging around me. "You need to calm down right now. It is just a massive bureaucratic mistake. The IRS has been auditing a lot of commercial accounts lately, and your name must have gotten crossed with someone else in their federal database. Running away from the bank was the worst thing you could have possibly done. It makes you look incredibly guilty. But they said I was going to federal prison." I cried, leaning my freezing body against the ice-covered brick wall. They said it was international wire fraud. Dad, I promise you absolutely nobody is going to prison today, Derek replied, adopting the patient, deeply condescending tone of a parent speaking to a frightened toddler. You know exactly how these government systems are. They are an absolute mess. Here is what you need to do. I need you to walk to the nearest police station immediately and turn yourself in to the desk sergeant. Just explain that you got scared and ran. I am going to call my corporate legal team right now. I will send the absolute best defense lawyer in the state down there to meet you. We will have this entire misunderstanding cleared up and have you safely bailed out before midnight. He sounded so incredibly convincing. If I had not seen that printed receipt with my own eyes, I might have actually believed him. I might have walked right into a police precinct and surrendered the rest of my life to a steel co. I stayed completely silent on the phone, letting the heavy snow fall onto my hunched shoulders. Dad. Are you still there? Derek asked. Just tell me what street you are on, and I will send a private car to pick you up. Before I could formulate an answer, I heard a faint rustling sound in the background on his end. The phone must have been pulled slightly away from his mouth. Then, distinct and unmistakable over the connection, I heard the voice of Brooke. She was not speaking to Derek. She was speaking to someone else in the room. Are the passports and the Belize tickets ready? She whispered sharply. The private car is going to be here in exactly 2 hours. We cannot leave any paper trail behind. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. Belize. A country notoriously known for having no extradition treaty with the United States regarding financial crimes. The puzzle was finally horrifyingly complete. They were not just setting me up to take the fall for their illegal enterprise. They were actively packing their bags to flee the country tonight, with whatever millions they had stolen, leaving me to rot in a federal penitentiary for crimes I did not commit. My own flesh and blood was orchestrating my permanent destruction, while calmly promising me a lawyer who would never actually arrive. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his plan was almost impossible for a father to comprehend. He wanted me locked safely inside a concrete holding cell, stripped of my freedom and my voice so I could not possibly interfere with his midnight escape. Dad. Please say something, Derek pressed, his fake concern perfectly modulated. Do the right thing. Surrender to the authorities. I slowly pulled the heavy plastic receiver away from my ear. I did not say goodbye. I did not scream. I simply placed the phone back onto its frozen metal hook with a soft, definitive click. The line went dead. I stood in the dark alley. My son was fleeing the country tonight. If he boarded, my life was over. I had to stop him right now before it was too late. I would not let him win this game. He would pay. The freezing receiver slipped from my fingers and clattered against the metal payphone. I stood in the dark alley, the howling Denver wind tearing through my old winter coat. But the cold was nothing compared to the ice currently freezing my heart. My son. My own flesh and blood. He had carefully engineered my destruction and was now preparing to sip champagne on a private flight to Belize while I was hunted by federal agents like an animal. I closed my eyes, letting the heavy snow accumulate on my eyelashes. A wave of suffocating exhaustion washed over me. I wanted to sit in the snow, close my eyes, and let the storm take me. It would be so incredibly easy to just give up, to let the cold numb the pain of betrayal until there was nothing left at all. But then I thought of Martha. I thought of the 30 years we spent building our life stone by stone, dollar by dollar. She would never forgive me if I surrendered our legacy to a monster, even if that monster was our own son. I forced my heavy, aching legs to move, stepping away from the brick wall of the laundromat. I shoved my bare, freezing hands deep into my coat pockets, trying to generate friction to restore circulation. As my right hand dug past the torn lining, my fingers brushed against something stiff. It was a small folded piece of paper. I frowned, my sluggish brain trying to process what it could be. It was not the crumpled $5 bill Brooke had thrown at me. That was in my left pocket alongside Martha's expired debit card. And it was not the terrifying IRS printout. I had dropped that on the floor of the bank manager office during my escape. I pulled my hand out into the biting wind. Pinched between my frozen thumb and forefinger was a small yellow square of paper. It looked like a sticky note. I stumbled toward a flickering street lamp at the edge of the alley, holding the paper up to the dim orange light. My mind raced back to the chaotic moments inside the bank. I remembered the heavy mahogany door flying open. I remembered the aggressive branch manager lunging forward and grabbing my arm. And in that chaotic split second, right as I was yanked backward, I remembered young Tyler leaning over the marble counter. I had felt a brief light pressure against my coat pocket, but the adrenaline had completely erased the memory until right now. The terrified bank clerk had purposely slipped something into my pocket before the manager dragged me away. I unfolded the yellow paper with trembling hands. It was not a bank receipt or a warning. It was an address written in hurried, panicked handwriting along with a short string of numbers. Below the address were 3 hastily scribbled words that made my heart completely stop in my chest. Martha Alden account. I stared at the yellow paper until the letters began to blur. Why would a bank clerk give me an address for an account bearing my late wife's name? The location written on the paper was not another bank branch. I recognized the street name immediately. It was located in the wealthy Cherry Creek district, an area known for luxury boutiques and high-security private corporate services. It was an address for a premier fortified private storage facility, the kind of place where millionaires kept untraceable assets, offshore documents, and things they never wanted the government to find. But Martha was a retired middle school teacher who clipped grocery coupons and kept her spare change in a glass jar on the kitchen counter. Why on earth would she have a secure vault at a high-end facility? A terrifying realization washed over me. Martha knew something. In the days leading up to her sudden heart attack, she had been incredibly quiet, spending hours locked in her small study. I had assumed she was just stressed about her upcoming medical tests, but this piece of paper proved she had been hiding something massive. I had to get to that facility. If Martha had left something there, it was the key to understanding this entire nightmare. I pulled the collar of my coat up over my ears and began the agonizing 2-mile trek toward Cherry Creek. The blizzard showed absolutely no signs of stopping. Every single step through the knee-deep snow was a grueling battle against my own failing body. My lungs burned, and my boots felt like they were filled with wet cement. But the need for the truth pushed me forward step by agonizing step. Almost an hour later, I finally stood across the street from the address. The building was an imposing fortress of black glass and reinforced concrete, looking more like a military bunker than a storage facility. A massive iron gate blocked the driveway, surrounded by high-definition security cameras that tracked every movement. I crossed the icy street, approaching the pedestrian entrance. A heavy steel door stood firmly shut, illuminated by a harsh white spotlight. Next to the door was a sleek black security panel. I brushed the snow off the screen to read the instructions. My heart plummeted all the way down to my frozen toes. To gain entry to the secure private vaults, the electronic system required 2 distinct forms of verification. The first was an active high-tier access card. The second was a registered biometric retina scan. I took a step back, the bitter wind howling in my ears. I reached into my pockets, feeling the pathetic weight of my current inventory. I did not have a high-tier access card. I certainly did not have my retinas registered in their elite database. I was a freezing wanted fugitive standing outside an impenetrable fortress, and the only resource I possessed in the entire world was the crumpled $5 bill sitting uselessly in my pocket. I stared through the thick glass of the pedestrian entrance, watching the young security guard at the reception desk inside. He was maybe 20 years old, wearing a Navy uniform that looked 2 sizes too big. He had his feet propped on a small space heater, entirely engrossed in a basketball game streaming on his phone. He had not even looked up when I approached the door. In my 40 years of running construction crews, I had managed hundreds of young guys exactly like him. They were easily bored, easily intimidated by authority, and almost always motivated by quick cash. If I tried to beg for help, he would just call the police. I needed to project total control. I needed to make him believe I was a wealthy client who was merely inconvenienced, not a desperate fugitive. But I also needed a bribe, and all I had was a single crumpled $5 bill. I stepped back into the shadows of the alcove, shielding myself from the biting wind. I rummaged through a nearby trash receptacle covered in snow and pulled out a discarded cardboard coffee sleeve. My freezing fingers were clumsy, but I carefully folded the thin cardboard. I molded it into a tight rectangular block. I smoothed out the $5 bill and wrapped it tightly around the cardboard core. I made sure the portrait of Lincoln was hidden, folding the edges, so it looked like a thick, substantial roll of currency. If I kept it mostly concealed in my palm, revealing only the green edges, it could easily pass for a few $100s to a distracted kid in a poorly lit lobby. I took a deep breath, forcing my shivering body to stand completely straight. I adjusted the collar of my worn, wet winter coat. I wiped the melting snow from my face and mentally stepped into the role of an eccentric man who owned the entire building. I walked directly up to the glass and slammed my fist hard against the heavy pane. The sudden noise echoed loudly in the quiet street. The guard jumped out of his chair, nearly dropping his phone. He looked toward the door, his eyes wide with surprise. I did not smile. I did not look desperate. I glared at him with the fierce, impatient annoyance of a man whose time is worth thousands of dollars an hour. I pointed a commanding finger at the electronic lock, silently demanding that he open it immediately. The kid hesitated, looking nervously at the security monitor on his desk. He walked slowly toward the glass, tapping the thick pane. He yelled something about the facility being closed for the night. I shook my head aggressively, completely dismissing his authority. I leaned close to the intercom speaker mounted on the brick wall. "Listen to me very carefully, son," I barked, using the deep voice I used when a subcontractor ruined a foundation pour. "My wife set up a private vault here under the name Martha Alden. The primary retinal scan is malfunctioning because of the freezing temperature, and I am not going to stand out in this blizzard for another 10 seconds. Open the secondary terminal right now before I call your district manager." The guard swallowed hard. "Sir, protocol says you need the primary access card and the eye scan. I cannot just let you in." I scoffed loudly, rolling my eyes. I pulled my right hand halfway out of my coat pocket, keeping my fingers wrapped tightly around my makeshift roll of cardboard and cash. "Look, kid," I said, dropping my voice to a whisper. "I know you are doing your job, but my wife is going to kill me if I do not retrieve our documents tonight. Let me access the manual backup terminal in the vestibule. I will swipe her card, verify my identity, and leave this thick stack of gratitude right here on the counter for your trouble. You can buy yourself something nice and your boss never has to know." The guard stared at the green edge of the money in my hand. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was doing the math, weighing the risk of breaking protocol against the promise of easy cash. He looked back at his phone, then up at my stern, unyielding face. I held my breath. Finally, he gave a nervous nod. He reached down to his belt and pressed a heavy red button. A loud mechanical buzz echoed through the freezing air, and the steel door clicked open. I pushed inside, the sudden warmth washing over my numb face. I kept the fake money hidden as the guard directed me to a small computer terminal mounted on the vestibule wall. He told me I had exactly 1 minute before the system timed out. My hands were shaking as I pulled Martha's faded debit card from my pocket. I slid it through the magnetic reader. The screen flashed a yellow warning asking for the retina scan. "Just hit the manual override for a secondary beneficiary," I ordered, projecting a false calm. He reached over and pressed a sequence of keys. The screen displayed a prompt for a secondary fingerprint verification. If Martha had not actually registered me before she died, my bluff would be exposed. I slowly pressed my freezing right thumb onto the glowing green scanner. A red laser swept across my skin. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. The silence was absolutely deafening. Then the scanner chimed a soft note. The screen flashed a brilliant green displaying the words, "Identity verified." From deep within the concrete belly of the building, a heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the floorboards, followed by the hiss of pneumatic hydraulics. The massive steel door of the inner vault began to slowly slide open. I let out a long breath, knowing that the answers I desperately needed to destroy my son were waiting for me on the other side of that door. The heavy steel door slid open with a deep echoing groan, revealing a stark, brilliantly lit hallway lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of identical metallic safety deposit boxes. The air inside the private vault was clinically cold, completely devoid of dust or moisture, smelling faintly of ozone and machine oil. I stepped over the thick metal threshold, the heavy door automatically sliding shut behind me with a solid final thud that sealed me off from the rest of the world. I stood alone in the silent, sterile corridor, the green light above the entrance illuminating a small brass placard that read Section 4. I walked slowly down the long aisle, my wet boots leaving faint traces of melting snow on the pristine white floor tiles. The numbers on the boxes ticked upwards as I moved. 410. 420. Finally, I stopped in front of box number 447. My hands were still numb from the bitter cold outside, but they trembled for an entirely different reason as I reached out to touch the cold steel. I inserted her faded debit card into the small electronic slot beneath the box number. A tiny green light flashed, and the heavy metal drawer popped outward with a soft click. I pulled it open. Inside, resting on the velvet lining, was a simple gray steel lockbox. It was not locked. I lifted the lid slowly, my heart pounding, a heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs. There were no stacks of hidden cash inside. There were no diamonds or bearer bonds. There were only 2 items. Resting on the bottom of the box was a worn burgundy leather journal, the exact same one Martha used to keep on her bedside table, and sitting right on top of it was a small silver USB flash drive. I reached in and picked up the journal. The leather was soft and familiar, carrying a faint, lingering scent of her lavender lotion. I traced my calloused thumb over the cover, a massive wave of grief threatening to pull me under. I took a deep, shaky breath and opened it to the first marked page. The sight of her elegant cursive handwriting hit me like a physical blow. It had been 2 years since I last saw her writing, and the familiarity of it made my eyes burn with unshed tears. But as I began to read the actual words, my sorrow rapidly transformed into a cold, paralyzing horror. The journal was not a collection of daily thoughts or gardening notes. It was a meticulous, detailed log of an independent investigation. Martha had not been blindly enjoying her retirement. Over the last 6 months of her life, she had noticed glaring discrepancies in the mail arriving at our house. She had intercepted several international bank statements addressed to a corporate entity bearing my name. Instead of throwing them away, my brilliant, resilient wife had started digging. Page after page, her neat handwriting detailed a massive web of deceit. She had tracked down the corporate registration of the shell company. She had found the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. But the most terrifying revelation was written in stark red ink near the end of the journal. Derek was not just hiding money from the federal government to avoid domestic taxes. He was actively laundering millions of dollars for a highly organized, violently dangerous real estate cartel operating out of the southern border. My hands shook violently as I read her final entry dated the exact night before she died. She wrote that she had finally gathered enough undeniable proof. She had discovered that Derek was using my clean, decades-old construction business as a legitimate front to funnel the cartel dirty money into commercial real estate developments right here in Denver. She wrote that it broke her heart into a million pieces to realize the monster our son had become, but she knew she had to protect me. She could not let me go down for his massive violent crimes. Her final chilling sentence was a declaration of action. She wrote that she had scheduled an emergency meeting with an old college friend who was now a senior agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The meeting was scheduled for exactly 8 in the morning. She never made it to that meeting. She died of a sudden catastrophic heart attack in our bedroom at 3 in the morning. The journal slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the floor. The sterile air in the vault suddenly felt incredibly thin, making it difficult to breathe. Martha had not died of natural causes. The timing was far too perfect, far too convenient, for the son who was facing decades in federal prison and the wrath of a bloodthirsty cartel. My wife had been murdered to protect a money-laundering empire. A cold, dark fury ignited deep within my chest, burning away the last remaining shreds of the tired, confused old man I had been just an hour ago. I was no longer a victim. I was a husband who had just discovered the horrific truth about his wife's untimely death. I slowly looked down at the steel lockbox. The small silver USB flash drive still sat there gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Martha had compiled the proof. She had left me the weapon I needed to destroy him. I picked up the flash drive. At the far end of the vault corridor, I saw a small private viewing booth equipped with a secure computer terminal designed for clients to access digital documents in complete privacy. I walked toward it with heavy, determined steps. I sat down in the leather chair, staring at the blank monitor. I inserted the silver drive into the computer port. A window popped open on the screen displaying a single encrypted audio file. I reached out my finger, hovering over the mouse. I took a deep breath and clicked play. The computer speakers crackled with a burst of harsh static before settling into a low, continuous hiss. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the faint clinking of ice against glass. Then a voice cut through the silence. It was Derek. His tone was not the smooth, arrogant drawl he had used on me just hours ago. He sounded terrified. His voice trembled slightly, lacking all of its usual polish and confidence. He was frantically apologizing, stumbling over his words. "I am telling you the federal heat is getting too close to the digital accounts," Derek stammered on the recording. "The IRS flagged the primary shell corporation this morning. They froze the routing numbers. I had to initiate the emergency protocol and shift the liability onto the secondary biometric profile. The old man is taking the fall. He is wandering the streets right now. The feds will pick him up by midnight, and that will buy us the time we need to clear the local ledgers." There was a long, agonizing pause on the recording. When the second voice finally spoke, my blood turned to ice. It was a deep, gravelly baritone, completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who commanded violence easily. "I do not care about your father." The cartel boss said, his words slow and deliberate. "I care about my $3 million. You promised that money would be washed and perfectly untraceable by the end of this week. Now you tell me the federal government has frozen the offshore accounts. You are playing a very dangerous game with my money, Derek. People have disappeared for much less." "No, listen to me, please," Derek begged, the panic in his voice escalating. "The cash is safe and secured. We are just going to bypass the digital route entirely. I am transferring the physical deed of the Denver property directly to your holding company tonight. It is a massive estate completely paid off. The transaction will legitimize the cash through a private real estate acquisition. Clean money. Untraceable. We sign the papers tonight at my house and the debt is entirely settled. You walk away with a clean property, and I take my cut and catch my flight to Belize." The cartel boss let out a low, menacing chuckle. "A house deed," he murmured. "Very well, but my lawyers will not accept digital copies or printed scans. If the federal agents are sniffing around your digital footprint, a printed copy is worthless. I want the original paper deed. I want the document with the original notary seals and the wet ink signatures. You hand me that original paper tonight, and your debt is cleared. If you fail to produce the original deed by midnight, my men will not be leaving your house empty-handed. We will take our 3 million in blood." "Do we have a clear understanding?" "Yes," Derek whispered quickly. "Yes, completely clear. I have the deed at the house. I will have it ready for you tonight." The recording clicked and went dead, leaving me in deafening silence. My mind raced, piecing together the final desperate fragments of his horrific plan. Derek did not kick me out just to make me a fugitive. He kicked me out because he needed to tear the house apart, looking for that original paper deed. He knew I kept all the physical copies of our important documents, but he did not know exactly where they were hidden. He thought I kept them in the standard filing cabinets in the home office. But he was wrong. 30 years ago, when I laid the foundation for that house, I built a custom floor safe directly into the concrete slab beneath the study. I covered it with seamless oak floorboards that only a master carpenter would know how to pry up. Martha was the only other person in the world who knew it existed. The original deed, the document Derek desperately needed to save his own life and escape the country, was sitting in that hidden safe right now. If Derek found that safe and handed the deed to the cartel, he would walk away with millions and vanish into Belize forever, leaving me to rot in federal prison for the rest of my natural life. He would absolutely get away with stealing my entire legacy. He would easily get away with murdering Martha. I pulled the silver flash drive from the computer, my grip tight enough to turn my knuckles white. A cold, absolute resolve settled over me, washing away the last traces of fear and exhaustion. I could not hide anymore. I could not run. If I wanted to clear my name, if I wanted justice for Martha, I had to stop that transaction from happening tonight. I had to get to that original deed before Derek did. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the wall of the vault. It was currently 8 in the evening. The cartel boss was arriving at midnight. I had exactly 4 hours. The bitter irony of the situation struck me like a physical blow. Just a few hours ago, I had been violently thrown out of my own home into a blinding blizzard. Now I realized with absolute certainty that the only way to survive was to go right back into the jaws of the beast. I had to return to the heavily fortified house. I had to break into the impenetrable fortress I had built with my own 2 hands, navigate past whatever security Derek had armed, and steal my own property right out from under the nose of a desperate murderer. I stood up from the leather chair, zipping my coat up to my chin. The game had completely changed. I was no longer the prey. I was the architect, and it was time to tear my house down. The walk back to my property was a brutal exercise in endurance. The Denver blizzard had not weakened in the slightest, blanketing the neighborhood in thick sheets of white. The streetlights flickered against the driving snow, casting distorted shadows across the icy pavement. I moved like a ghost through the streets, keeping my head down and my collar pulled up against the freezing wind. My legs felt like lead weights, and every joint in my 70-year-old body screamed in protest, but I did not stop. The cold rage burning inside my chest was a powerful furnace, keeping my blood pumping and my mind focused on the task ahead. When the familiar silhouette of my sprawling estate finally loomed through the storm, a bitter wave of irony washed over me. I had poured my sweat and 30 years of my life into building this sanctuary. I had designed every single wall to protect my family from the outside world. Now the fortress I had lovingly constructed was harboring the very monsters who had destroyed my life. I approached from the rear, slipping through the snow-covered evergreen trees. Derek had spent a fortune installing a state-of-the-art perimeter security system. High-definition infrared cameras were mounted under the eaves and motion sensors buried in the lawn. A normal burglar would trigger an armed response within 10 seconds. But I was not a normal burglar. I was the architect. I knew exactly where the blind spots were because I had designed the exterior lighting layout. I stayed low, using the heavy shadows of the brick retaining wall to mask my movements. I crept toward the commercial-grade air conditioning units sitting on the side of the house. Derek had the security technicians wire the doors and windows, but he ignored the structural foundation. When I poured the concrete slab 3 decades ago, I installed an oversized ventilation shaft designed to provide direct exterior access to the main HVAC trunk line for heavy maintenance. It was hidden behind a heavy iron grate that most people assumed was a drainage vent. I knelt in the snow, my bare fingers numb, as I dug through the icy drift covering the grate. I found the hidden release latch flush against the brickwork. I pressed it hard, and the iron cover swung open silently on its well-oiled hinges. I squeezed my broad shoulders into the dark, narrow opening, pulling the grate shut behind me just as a gust of wind swept away my footprints. The air inside the ventilation shaft was dry, stale, and smelled faintly of dust and old metal. I pulled a small penlight from my coat pocket, grateful I had always kept a few basic tools on me, and clicked it on. The narrow beam of light illuminated the long, metallic tunnel stretching out before me. It was not meant for a grown man, certainly not one my age, but I had designed the main trunk line slightly wider than the standard residential code required. I laid flat on my stomach and began to drag myself forward. The physical toll was immediate and agonizing. The cold metal bit through my damp clothes, chilling my skin. The tight space forced me to pull myself along, using only my elbows and the tips of my boots. With every inch, my shoulders ground against the narrow walls, and my knees throbbed with a sharp, unrelenting ache. The dust coated my throat, making it difficult to breathe, but I did not dare to cough. I had to remain absolutely silent. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional agony of what I had discovered in the vault pushed me relentlessly forward. Every time I felt the urge to stop, every time my aging muscles threatened to give out, I thought of Martha. I thought of my brilliant, loving wife lying on our bedroom floor, dropping her medication while our son watched her die to protect his money. That horrific image fueled my movements, turning my pain into a weapon. I crawled like an old wounded soldier through the dark belly of my own home, navigating the complex maze of ductwork purely from memory. I took a left turn at the main junction, passing directly over the kitchen ceiling. I could faintly hear the low hum of the refrigerator below. I continued dragging myself forward, my elbows raw and bleeding. I was heading toward the central study, the room where the hidden floor safe was located. As I neared the final intersection, the pitch-black darkness of the ductwork was suddenly broken by a faint, warm glow illuminating the dust particles in the air ahead. It was light bleeding up from the floor vent in the study. I turned off my penlight and moved forward with agonizing slowness, terrified that the metal under my weight would pop or groan. I reached the edge of the vent and carefully positioned my face over the heavy brass grate. I held my breath, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second to brace myself for whatever I was about to witness. I slowly opened my eyes and peered down through the narrow angled slats. The study looked exactly as I had left it, with its rich mahogany bookshelves and the large leather wingback chairs. But the atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. Standing directly in the center of the Persian rug, less than 10 feet below me, was Derek. His face was pale and slick with nervous sweat. Next to him stood Brooke, her arms crossed tightly, staring anxiously at the large oak desk. Sitting in my chair, casually leaning back with a glass of my best scotch in his hand, was a massive, scarred man in a dark tailored suit. Spread across the polished surface of the desk in front of him were dozens of thick, banded stacks of $100 bills. The cartel boss had just arrived and the meeting had already begun. I stared down through the narrow slits of the brass grate, hardly daring to draw a breath. The sheer amount of money resting on my mahogany desk was staggering. Bundles of $100 bills were stacked in a pyramid, wrapped in tight rubber bands. It was $3 million in raw, untraceable cash. The harsh light caught the edges of the bills, casting shadows across the polished wood. Sitting in my chair was a man who radiated a terrifying, quiet violence. He wore a tailored suit that barely concealed the muscular build of a seasoned enforcer. A long scar ran down his neck, disappearing beneath his white collar. He was completely still, watching my son with the cold gaze of a predator observing prey. Derek was sweating profusely. He stood opposite the desk, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. Brooke stood behind him, her arrogant smirk gone, replaced by a trembling mask of fear. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. I pressed my ear closer to the cold metal of the vent. The cartel boss leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the desk next to the cash. He picked up a bundle, flipping it casually in his hand, before dropping it back onto the pile. The soft thud echoed loudly in the quiet study. "We had an agreement." "Derek," the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You told my employers the physical deed to this estate would be ready tonight. You assured us that this transaction would be perfectly seamless. So far, all I see is a nervous broker making empty promises. I do not like empty promises. They are bad for my business." Derek swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. "I have it," he stammered, his voice thin. "I absolutely have it. It is just misplaced somewhere. My father is an old man, and his memory is failing. He hid the documents before I had him removed from the premises today. I just need more time to locate his hiding spot. It is here, I swear, on my life." The cartel boss slowly stood up from the chair. He was remarkably tall, towering over Derek. "That is a poor choice of words," Derek the man whispered, stepping around the desk. "Swearing on your life implies your life still has value to me. Without that deed, you are nothing but a liability. And my employers eliminate liabilities." I watched as Brooke instinctively took a step backward, bumping into the tall bookshelves. The cartel boss reached into his jacket. He did not pull a weapon, but the movement made Derek flinch. Instead, the man pulled out a silver pocket watch. He clicked it open, checking the time. "It is currently 11:50. You have exactly 10 minutes to place the original deed in my hands. If you fail to produce the document by midnight, I will take my money back. And then my associates waiting outside will dismantle you and your wife into pieces so small they will never find your bodies. Do we have a clear understanding?" Derek nodded frantically, sweat dripping onto his silk tie. "Yes, absolutely clear," he gasped, eyes wide with blind panic. "Give me 10 minutes. I will tear this house apart. I will find it." The cartel boss snapped the watch shut with a metallic click. "Your time starts right now. I am going to wait in your living room. I do not want to look at your face again until you have my paperwork." The massive man turned and walked out of the study, footsteps echoing down the hallway. The moment he was gone, Derek spun around and grabbed Brooke by the shoulders, shaking her roughly. "Do not just stand there," he hissed, voice trembling with rage and terror. "Check the guest bedrooms upstairs. Rip open the mattresses if you have to. He has to have a secondary safe somewhere." Brooke shoved his hands away, her face contorted in anger. "This is your fault," she spat back. "You said this was going to be a clean exchange. If we die tonight, I swear I will kill you myself before they do." She turned and ran out of the study, heading for the main staircase. Derek stood alone for a second, running his hands through his hair. He kicked the side of the heavy oak desk, letting out a muffled scream of frustration before sprinting out toward the kitchen to search the pantry. The heavy double doors of the study remained open, but the room was finally blissfully empty. This was my only chance. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pushed my weight off my elbows and reached for the release clips inside the grate. I had designed these clips to be easily removable. I pinched the metal tabs together, holding my breath as the grate came loose. I slid it quietly into the ductwork beside me, ensuring it did not scrape the metal. The opening was just barely wide enough for me to fit through. I shifted my body, lowering my legs down through the hole first. I hung suspended for a second, arms taking my full weight. The muscles in my shoulders burned fiercely, threatening to tear, but I gritted my teeth and let go. I dropped the remaining distance, landing silently on the thick Persian rug. My knees buckled from the impact, sending a jolt of pain up my spine, but I managed to stay upright. I was finally back inside my own study. The $3 million sat unguarded on my desk, just a few feet away. But I did not care about the money. I dropped to my knees in the center of the room. I ran my freezing hands over the grain of the floorboards, searching for the tiny invisible seam I had carved 30 years ago. I had to open the floor safe and take that deed before Derek returned. I pushed the heavy Persian rug aside, the wool folding with a soft thud. My knees ached against the bare oak floorboards, but I ignored the pain. I dragged my fingertips across the smooth wood, tracing the familiar grain I had sanded down 3 decades ago. To the untrained eye, the floor looked seamless. I knew exactly where to look. I crawled toward the corner near the mahogany desk, keeping a watchful eye on the open double doors. I could hear the muffled sounds of absolute chaos coming from the second floor. Heavy footsteps pounded against the ceiling as Derek tore through the guest bedrooms, slamming doors and throwing furniture. He had less than 8 minutes left to produce the document for the cartel boss waiting in the living room. I found the tiny, imperceptible groove hidden beneath the baseboard. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my penlight, using its thin metal casing as a wedge. I slipped the metal edge into the groove and pressed down with all the strength my tired hands could muster. The locking mechanism gave way with a satisfying click. A rectangular section of the oak floorboard popped up about an inch. I grabbed the edges and lifted the false wooden panel away, exposing the cold, dark steel of the heavy floor safe embedded directly into the concrete foundation. The safe was an older mechanical model built long before digital keypads. It required a physical combination, a sequence of numbers Martha and I had chosen the day we moved into the house. I rested my hand on the cold brass dial. My breathing was ragged, echoing loudly in the quiet study. Every second ticked by like an eternity. Above me, I heard a loud crash followed by Derek screaming in sheer frustration. He was running out of time, and the panic was making him careless. I had to be fast. If he came downstairs and found me sitting here, he would kill me himself to get his hands on the deed. I focused my vision on the brass dial, my fingers trembling slightly. I turned the cold metal knob to the right, stopping on the number 4. Then I spun it back to the left, passing 0, and stopped on 14. Finally, I turned it to the right one last time, landing squarely on 82. April 14th, 1982. The day Martha and I were married. A sharp pang of sorrow hit my chest, but I pushed it down, burying the grief under a thick layer of cold resolve. I grabbed the heavy steel handle. I took a deep breath, praying the internal tumblers had not rusted over the years, and pulled the lever downward. The internal bolts slid back with a loud metallic clanking sound. It seemed deafening in the silent room, and I froze, terrified the noise had echoed down the hallway. I waited for 5 agonizing seconds, listening intently. The house remained chaotic. The cartel boss was waiting in the living room, and Derek was frantically destroying the upstairs bedrooms. The coast was clear. I pulled the heavy steel door open, the hinges protesting with a faint squeak. A puff of stale, dry air hit my face. I reached my hand down into the dark cavity of the safe, stretching out to grasp the thick manila envelope holding the original deed to the property. That envelope was the key to my salvation. It was the only physical evidence that could stop Derek from finalizing his blood money transaction and escaping the country. I swept my hand across the bottom of the steel box. My fingers brushed against nothing but cold metal and a thin layer of dust. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. I leaned closer, shining the beam of my penlight directly into the belly of the safe. The bright light illuminated the interior, revealing the devastating truth. The safe was completely empty. There was no manila envelope. There were no backup documents. There was absolutely nothing. A wave of nauseating panic washed over me. This was impossible. I placed the original deed in this safe with my own hands 5 years ago. Martha was the only other living soul who knew the combination, and she would never have removed it without telling me. My mind raced, trying to process the horrifying reality. If the deed was not in the safe, where was it? Had Derek somehow discovered the hiding spot? But if he had, why was he upstairs tearing the house apart in a blind panic? It made absolutely no sense. I slumped back on my heels, staring blankly at the empty steel box. The master plan I formulated in the freezing alley was entirely built on retrieving that document. Without it, I had no leverage. I had no way to stop the cartel from taking my home. I was completely out of moves. I placed my hands on the floor, preparing to push myself up and retreat to the ventilation shaft before Derek returned. But before I could shift my weight, a shadow fell across the doorway. I froze, every muscle locking up in sheer terror. I did not dare to breathe. I listened as soft footsteps entered the room, the sound muffled by the thick Persian rug. The footsteps stopped just a few feet behind me. I slowly turned my head, my eyes traveling up from the floor. Standing there, bathed in the dim light of the study, was Brooke. Her arrogant smirk had returned, pulling the corners of her mouth into a cruel, malicious smile. In her right hand she held a thick, worn manila envelope. The red notary seal was clearly visible on the outside flap. "Looking for this?" Dad, Brooke asked, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. She tapped the heavy envelope against her thigh, her eyes burning with dark amusement. "You really thought you were the only one in this house who knew how to keep a secret?" I stared blankly at her, my racing mind struggling to process the sudden shift in reality. I fully expected her to suddenly scream, to call out for Derek, to alert the dangerous men currently waiting just down the hall. But she did not make a single sound. Instead, Brooke slowly reached behind her back and quietly pushed the heavy wooden double doors of the study completely shut until the brass latch finally clicked into place. She walked confidently further into the room, her high heels sinking silently into the thick Persian rug, moving with the terrifying grace of a deadly viper about to strike. She looked directly down at me, still kneeling on the cold floor beside the empty safe. The thick manila envelope containing my original property deed was clutched tightly against her chest. I slowly stood up to face her, my old muscles aching completely, ready for whatever twisted game she was about to play. I quietly asked her what she wanted, my voice barely above a whisper to avoid drawing attention from the hallway. Brooke let out a very soft, highly mocking laugh. She walked right past me and leaned against the heavy oak desk, her cold eyes drifting toward the $3 million in raw cash sitting in neat banded stacks. She slowly ran a manicured finger over the top bundle of $100 bills. She plainly told me she was completely sick of her weak husband. She said Derek was incredibly weak, a truly pathetic coward, who was currently upstairs having a massive nervous breakdown because he could not handle the pressure of the real world. She quickly looked back at me, her eyes entirely devoid of any human warmth or compassion. She said she had actually known about the hidden floor safe for several months. She had secretly seen me checking the combination late one night and simply memorized the numbers. She had carefully removed the deed weeks ago as a personal insurance policy, just in case Derek ever tried to cut her out of the cartel deal. And right now, she proposed a brand new arrangement. She offered me a deal that sounded far too good to be true. Brooke said if I helped her frame Derek for the entire money laundering operation, she would make sure I got my house back. All I had to do was stand there, corroborate her story to the authorities when they arrived, and claim Derek had held us both hostage. In exchange for my false testimony, she would take the $3 million in cash off the desk and walk out the front door tonight, leaving Derek to face the wrath of the cartel and the federal government alone. It was a tempting offer for a desperate man. For a fleeting second, the idea of getting my home back and watching my treacherous son rot in a federal penitentiary felt like absolute poetic justice. But I had lived 70 years on this earth, and I had learned the hard way that a snake never changes its scales. My gut instinct, honed by decades of dealing with crooked contractors and shady suppliers, screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I looked at her face. She was trying to appear relaxed, but her posture was incredibly rigid. Her eyes kept darting nervously toward the large mahogany bookshelf positioned directly over my left shoulder. It was a microscopic tell, but in high-stakes negotiations, those tiny details are everything. I shifted my weight slightly, pretending to consider her generous offer, and used the movement to glance at the bookshelf. Resting on the second shelf, partially concealed behind a thick, leather-bound encyclopedia, was her smartphone. It was positioned perfectly, the camera lens pointing squarely at my face, and pulsing steadily in the dark gap between the books was a tiny, unmistakable red light. The audio recording application was running. The devastating truth crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. Brooke was not offering me a lifeline. She was digging my grave. She was trying to bait me into agreeing to a conspiracy, attempting to get my voice on tape, admitting to participating in the extortion and the cartel money laundering scheme. She planned to take that recording, hand it straight to the federal agents or the cartel boss waiting in the living room, and use it as undeniable proof that I was the criminal mastermind pulling the strings all along. She was going to frame both me and Derek, take the $3 million, and vanish completely free of any guilt or suspicion. The absolute sheer malice of her plan took my breath away. She stared at me, waiting for my verbal agreement, her fake smile trembling slightly at the edges. She asked me if we had a deal, leaning forward to make sure the hidden microphone picked up my response. I did not give her the satisfaction of an answer. I moved faster than a 70-year-old man had any right to ever move. I lunged past her, completely ignoring the thick envelope in her hand, and grabbed the heavy encyclopedia from the shelf. I ripped the smartphone from its hiding place. Brooke gasped, the color instantly draining from her face as she realized her trap had been discovered. She lunged toward me, her manicured claws reaching for the device, demanding I give it back immediately. I did not hesitate. I raised the phone high above my head and smashed it down onto the solid brass corner of my mahogany desk with every ounce of strength I possessed. The glass screen shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments, and the casing cracked in half, instantly killing the recording. Brooke opened her mouth to scream, her eyes wide with absolute unadulterated fury. But before a single sound could escape her throat, heavy oak doors of the study were violently kicked open, slamming against the walls with the force of a bomb going off. The heavy oak doors of the study exploded inward with such terrifying violence that a solid brass hinge completely snapped off the doorframe. The thick wood crashed against the bookshelves, sending dozens of heavy volumes tumbling to the floor. Brooke let out a piercing shriek and stumbled backward, dropping the manila envelope as she raised her hands to protect her face. I froze, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, every muscle locking up in sheer panic. Standing in the doorway, panting heavily like a hunted animal, was Derek. The polished, arrogant financial broker I had known for all these long years was entirely gone. In his place stood a cornered, rabid predator, completely stripped of his polite, civilized mask. His expensive silk tie was torn, his crisp white shirt soaked in nervous sweat, and his eyes wide with a manic, bloodshot intensity. But the most terrifying detail was not his deranged appearance. It was the matte black Glock 19 he held tightly in his trembling right hand, and the cold metal barrel was pointed directly at my chest. Derek stepped into the study, kicking the broken door out of his way. His fractured mind was entirely focused on survival. He locked his wild eyes onto the manila envelope resting on the Persian rug near the feet of his terrified wife. He let out a dark, highly disturbing, guttural laugh. He waved the heavy pistol toward the center of the room, motioning aggressively for me to move away from Brooke. I slowly backed up, keeping my hands raised high where he could clearly see them. Derek ordered Brooke to pick up the envelope and check the notary seal. She quickly scrambled to her feet, hastily snatching the heavy document right from the floor. She nodded frantically, confirming it was the original deed. Derek kept the gun trained squarely on my heart as he reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of thick industrial zip ties. He kicked a heavy wooden chair toward me. "Sit down right now," he commanded, his voice cracking with a terrifying mix of blind panic and absolute malice. I slowly lowered myself into the chair, knowing any sudden movement would cause his trembling finger to pull the trigger. Derek stepped behind me. I felt the cold plastic of the zip ties wrap around my wrists, biting deeply into my skin as he pulled them excruciatingly tight against the wooden arms of the chair. He secured my ankles to the heavy legs with ruthless efficiency, ensuring I could not move an inch. Once I was completely immobilized, he stepped around to face me. He tucked the hot gun into his waistband and grabbed handfuls of his own hair, pacing back and forth across the study like a caged beast. He stopped right in front of me, his face twisted in pure disgust. "You just could not stay away, could you?" he spat, leaning in close. "You had to crawl back here through the snow and try to ruin everything I built. You are a useless relic, Dad. You are a stubborn, outdated dinosaur who stood right in the middle of the road while the rest of the world moved forward without you. You spent 40 years breaking your back for pennies building stupid little houses, and you expected me to do the exact same thing. You wanted me to be completely satisfied with absolute mediocrity." He turned around and violently grabbed the $3 million in cash from the mahogany desk, shoving a banded bundle of $100 bills right into my face. "This is real wealth," he screamed, the thick veins bulging in his neck. "This is how the real world operates. You do not get rich by working hard and following the rules of society. You get rich by taking exactly what you want and letting the weak people take the fall for your mistakes. I built an international empire right under your pathetic nose. I used your clean reputation to move mountains of cartel cash, and you never even noticed because you were too busy living in the past. You thought you were so incredibly smart, protecting your precious family legacy. Your legacy is absolutely nothing. You are nothing. I am the one who finally secured our future. I am the one who took the necessary risks, and tonight I am going to hand over that deed, walk out of this house with enough money to disappear forever, and you are going to stay right here and burn to ashes with your outdated morals." I sat there bound to the heavy wooden chair, listening to the twisted justifications of a monster. The physical pain in my wrists was sharp and relentless, cutting off the circulation to my freezing hands, but it paled in comparison to the clarity settling over my mind. He was right about one thing. I had let my unconditional love for my son prevent me from seeing the ruthless criminal he had become. But the time for blind love was officially over. The desperate panic that drove me through the freezing blizzard was gone, replaced by a deep, freezing calm. I did not look at the loaded gun in his waistband. I did not look at the $3 million scattered carelessly on my desk. I looked into his bloodshot, terrified eyes. The chaotic room seemed to fall completely silent. The howling winter wind outside faded away into nothingness. The frantic breathing of Brooke, cowering in the corner, ceased. It was just me and the dangerous, volatile stranger who used to be my son. I took a slow, steady breath, letting the heavy silence stretch out until his manic energy faltered for a fraction of a second. I leaned forward as much as the tight plastic restraints would allow, never breaking our intense eye contact. I looked Derek right in the eye and asked the ultimate question. What exactly did you do to your own beloved mother? For a long moment, the only sound in the ruined study was the ragged, uneven breathing of my son. He stood completely still, staring down at me with the heavy black Glock 19 still gripped tightly in his right trembling hand. And then a sound escaped his throat that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. It was a laugh. It was a dark, bitter, hollow sound that held absolutely no joy, only the twisted relief of a man who no longer had to hide his darkest sin. He lowered the barrel of the gun, slightly shaking his head, as if I had just asked him the most ridiculous question in the world. He turned his back on me for a second, running his free hand through his sweat-soaked hair before spinning back around. The frantic, manic energy had suddenly drained out of him, replaced by a terrifying, clinical coldness. He stepped closer, leaning in so near that I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. He told me she brought it entirely upon herself. He said his mother could never just leave things alone. She had to pry. She had to dig into his private accounts and play the amateur detective. He coldly confessed that on the very night she died, she had confronted him in the upstairs hallway. She had a folder full of bank statements and wire transfer receipts. She threatened to go to the FBI the very next morning to expose everything, claiming she was doing it to save his soul and protect my name. Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes as he recalled her desperate pleas. He told her she was ruining his life, that she was destroying his one chance at building a real financial empire. The argument escalated, and then he said the stress simply became too much for her weak heart. She gasped, clutching her chest, and fell to her knees right there on the hardwood floor. Derek spoke with a chilling detachment, narrating the death of his own mother like a mundane business transaction. He watched her struggle to breathe. He watched her fumble frantically in the pocket of her robe, her trembling fingers pulling out the small amber bottle of nitroglycerin pills her doctor had prescribed for emergencies. But her hands were shaking too badly. The bottle slipped from her grasp, bouncing on the floorboards, the tiny white pills scattering across the wood. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror and silent pleading, silently begging her only son to help her, to hand her just one single pill. Derek paused his story, his face completely blank. He said he stood there looking at her, and then he looked at the folder of incriminating evidence lying on the floor next to her. In that crucial fleeting second, he made a calculated choice. He raised his foot and deliberately kicked the scattered pills completely out of her reach, sweeping them deep under the heavy oak credenza. Then he simply stood there, with his hands in his pockets, and watched the light fade from her eyes. He watched the woman who gave him life suffocate on the floor, all to protect his bloody money. He justified it, claiming it was the only logical solution to an impossible problem. He said her death was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of his future. As those vile words left his mouth, a profound and irreversible transformation occurred deep within my soul. The crushing grief that had weighed me down for 2 years instantly evaporated. The desperate, unconditional love of a father, a love that had blinded me to his true nature for so long, died completely in that very moment. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or thrash against the thick plastic zip ties binding my wrists. Instead, a pure, terrifyingly cold wrath filled the empty void in my chest. It was a calculated, absolute vengeance. The man standing in front of me was no longer my child. He was merely an obstacle. He was a rabid animal that needed to be put down, and I was going to be the one to do it. I stared back at him, my facial expression perfectly neutral, my cold heart beating with a slow, deliberate, mechanical precision. I did not offer him the reaction he desperately craved. I did not beg for my life, nor did I break down in hysterical weeping. I simply looked at him with the cold, assessing gaze of a builder inspecting a deeply flawed structure that had to be demolished. "You are a truly pathetic creature," I whispered, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You sold your own soul for paper, and you are far too stupid to realize that you have already lost everything. You will never escape this house tonight. You will never spend a single dime of that money. You will die alone, and absolutely no one will mourn your passing." Derek stared at me, his confidence faltering under my icy gaze. The realization that he could not break my spirit, that his ultimate confession had only forged me into something much harder, ignited a sudden, uncontrollable rage within him. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He let out a feral, wordless scream of frustration. He lunged forward, raising the heavy black pistol high into the air. He did not aim to shoot. Instead, he brought the solid steel butt of the gun crashing down violently against the side of my head. A blinding flash of white light exploded behind my eyes, followed instantly by a sickening crunch. The intense pain radiated through my skull, but it was quickly swallowed by a rushing wave of dark, heavy numbness. The chaotic study, the stacks of stolen cash, and the terrified face of my son all rapidly dissolved into an overwhelming, suffocating blackness as my head slumped forward onto my chest. The suffocating blackness did not release its grip on me peacefully. It tore away in jagged, painful fragments, replaced by a blinding, throbbing agony from my skull. I tried to lift my head, but my neck muscles refused to cooperate, sending a wave of nausea over me. The Persian rug was gone. My right cheek was pressed hard against the freezing damp surface of poured concrete. I groaned, trying to bring my hands to my face, but they would not move. My wrists were pulled forcefully behind my back, bound tightly together by industrial zip ties. The rough edges bit deeply into my skin with every slight movement. I forced my heavy eyelids open, blinking against the harsh, stinging air. The dim, flickering light of a single exposed bulb revealed the familiar, stark concrete walls of my own basement. I was sitting on the freezing floor, my arms chained backward around the thick, cast-iron water main that fed the entire estate. But it was not the cold or the crushing headache that fully awakened my senses. It was the smell. It was thick, sickening, and overwhelming. The heavy, unmistakable odor of rotten eggs filled the stagnant basement air. It was raw, natural gas, and it was pumping into the enclosed space at a rapid rate. I tilted my head back, my eyes watering from the toxic fumes, and looked toward the far corner of the room. The main utility lines came into the house through that wall. I could hear the high-pitched hissing sound, echoing in the damp space. Someone had completely opened the main pressure valves on the furnace and the heavy-duty water heater, bypassing the safety regulators I had installed decades ago. The realization of what was happening hit me harder than the pistol my son had used to knock me unconscious. Derek had not just dragged me down here to hide me from the cartel boss. He had brought me down here to permanently erase me from the face of the earth. His master plan was brilliant in its absolute cruelty. He was going to hand the original deed over to the cartel enforcer, take the $3 million, and walk out the front door with Brooke. They would drive to a private airfield board a chartered jet and disappear into the night sky, headed for a country with no extradition laws. Meanwhile, the heavy gas would slowly fill the basement, creeping up through the floorboards and the ventilation shafts I had just crawled through. It would fill the study, the kitchen, and the living room. All it would take was a single spark: the pilot light on the stove, the electrical arc from the refrigerator compressor kicking on, or perhaps a timed ignition device Derek had left behind. The resulting explosion would be absolutely catastrophic. It would instantly level the $2 million estate, incinerating the house, the empty floor safe, and any lingering physical evidence of his money laundering operation. And at the epicenter of the blast, the authorities would find the charred remains of a confused old man. The police and fire investigators would easily conclude it was a tragic domestic accident. They would assume the grieving retired contractor, suffering from a deteriorating mental state, had come back to his empty house, fumbled with the utility valves in the dark basement, and blown himself to pieces. Derek would not just get away with stealing millions of dollars from a violent drug cartel. He would get away with the brutal murder of his own father, wrapping up every single loose end in a fireball of destruction. He had sentenced me to the gas chamber in the very home I had built to keep my family safe. I pulled violently against the thick plastic zip ties securing my wrists to the iron pipe. The plastic did not stretch. It only cut deeper into my flesh, sending warm ribbons of blood trickling down my numb fingers. I planted my heavy work boots against the concrete floor and pushed with all the strength left in my 70-year-old legs, trying to snap the bonds by brute force. My joints popped and my muscles screamed in agony, but the plastic held perfectly firm. The hissing sound of the escaping gas seemed to grow louder with every passing second, a deadly countdown clock ticking away the final moments of my life. My lungs were already burning fiercely. Every breath I took felt like inhaling broken glass. The toxic carbon monoxide was rapidly displacing the oxygen in the windowless room. I knew from my safety training on commercial job sites exactly how little time I had. At this high concentration of raw gas, a healthy grown man would lose consciousness in less than 5 minutes. At my age, with a severe head injury and my heart racing in blind panic, I had maybe 3 minutes before my brain simply shut down. Once I passed out, death would follow quietly in the dark, long before the final devastating explosion ever occurred. My vision began to blur at the edges, a dark gray tunnel, slowly closing in around the flickering light bulb. A wave of terrifying dizziness washed over me, causing my head to loll forward against my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head to clear the creeping numbness. I could not die down here. I refused to let the man who murdered Martha win. I refused to let him walk away with millions of dollars. I had to break free. I dragged my bound hands frantically up and down the rough surface of the pipe, praying to find a sharp edge, anything that could tear through the thick plastic holding me hostage. But the metal was perfectly smooth, worn down by decades of moisture and time. The air in the basement was becoming thick, distorting the walls. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. I was suffocating. I needed a miracle, and I needed it right now. My fading mind raced through decades of construction knowledge, frantically searching for a solution hidden in the darkness. Striking metal against metal in a room completely flooded with raw natural gas was a guaranteed death sentence. A single rogue spark would instantly ignite the air, turning the enclosed basement into a blazing inferno that would consume everything. I desperately needed a tool that would not spark. My heavy leather tool belt was long gone, but my bound hands brushed against the front of my waist. I was wearing my old reliable work trousers held up by a thick leather belt with a solid brass buckle. Brass does not create sparks when struck against iron or steel. It was a massive gamble, but as the suffocating gas filled my lungs, it was the only card I had left to play. I contorted my aching body, twisting my torso as far as the agonizing plastic zip ties would allow. I managed to unhook the heavy brass buckle with my numb, bleeding fingers. I gripped the thick leather strap tightly behind my back, using it like a crude whip. Directly above my head, connecting to the cast iron pipe I was tethered to, was a secondary PVC water valve. I swung my arms backward with every ounce of remaining strength, bringing the brass buckle crashing down against the plastic valve housing. The first strike did nothing but send a painful shockwave up my shoulders. I swung again, ignoring the burning in my oxygen-starved lungs. And then, on the third desperate strike, I heard a sharp crack echo through the dark room. The pressurized plastic housing shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. A massive, deafening roar echoed through the basement as a jet of freezing high-pressure water exploded outward from the broken valve. The icy blast hit me squarely in the chest, the sheer force nearly knocking me completely unconscious. But the freezing temperature was a brutal, necessary blessing. The intense cold violently jolted my system, instantly clearing the dizzy fog of carbon monoxide poisoning from my failing brain. I opened my mouth wide, gasping greedily for the cleaner air churning within the violent spray. The rushing water cascaded heavily down my arms, soaking entirely into my torn sleeves and pooling thickly around my bound wrists. This was exactly what I needed to happen. The cold water mixed rapidly with the warm blood running from my deep cuts, creating a highly slick, extremely slippery surface against the rigid, unforgiving plastic of the zip ties. I planted my heavy boots firmly on the rapidly flooding concrete floor, took a deep breath of the waterlogged air, and pulled my hands in opposite directions with everything I had left. The friction burned like a hot iron brand, tearing the skin directly off the back of my knuckles, but the lubrication finally worked. With a sickening pop of dislocating joints and tearing flesh, my bloody hands slipped completely free from the plastic restraints. I collapsed forward onto the soaking concrete, coughing violently as the freezing water rapidly flooded the basement floor. I was finally free, but the lethal gas was still pouring relentlessly into the enclosed room. Every primal instinct in my battered body screamed at me to run, to scramble desperately up the egress window well, and escape into the freezing blizzard before the entire house detonated. But the cold fury that had permanently replaced my grief demanded a completely different outcome. I could not simply run away and let Derek walk out the front door with $3 million, leaving me with nothing but wet clothes and a federal murder charge hanging over my head. I had to ensure he never left this property. I crawled forward through the rising, freezing water, keeping my face as close to the flooded floor as possible to avoid the rising gas fumes. I moved blindly through the absolute dark, my shaking hands tracing the familiar concrete foundation until my fingers brushed against the large metal panel of the main electrical breaker box. Derek had spent a fortune outfitting the estate with a highly advanced smart home security system. He controlled the electronic locks, the high-definition cameras, and the perimeter alarms straight from his phone. But what he did not realize was that I was the master builder who had physically wired the main conduit. I knew the system possessed a hardwired manual override designed exclusively for catastrophic emergencies. I pulled the heavy metal panel open, my bloody fingers slipping against the tight latch. I ignored the standard electrical breakers and reached deep into the secondary control housing. I found the thick red industrial switch connected directly to the exterior hurricane shutters. When I originally built this house 30 years ago, I installed commercial-grade steel shutters hidden within the exterior window frames and doors, designed to withstand catastrophic weather events and structural lockdowns. Derek thought they were just an aesthetic feature he could ignore. He was dead wrong. I grabbed the heavy red switch and pulled it downward with all my strength. A massive, heavy clunk resonated through the floorboards, directly above my head, followed instantly by the mechanical grinding of heavy motors engaging all at once. Even over the deafening hiss of the broken water pipe, I could hear the violent slams of the thick steel plates dropping into place one by one. Bam, bam, bam. The heavy metal shutters locked seamlessly into the reinforced concrete foundation, completely sealing every exterior door and window on the upper levels. I slumped exhausted against the concrete wall, a grim smile spreading across my face as the cold water rushed around my aching legs. Upstairs, the master plan of my traitorous son had just come to a terrifying, abrupt halt. Derek Brooke and the ruthless cartel boss were no longer standing inside a luxurious estate. They were completely and permanently locked inside a heavily fortified steel cage of their own making, and there was absolutely no way out. The freezing water in the basement was rising rapidly, swirling around my knees and mixing with the suffocating stench of raw natural gas. I had successfully trapped the monsters inside my home, but if I did not escape this subterranean concrete box immediately, I would still die right alongside them. I forced my battered body to move, wading through the dark, turbulent water toward the far corner of the foundation. When I designed this massive basement 30 years ago, I insisted on installing a secondary commercial drainage pipe as a fail-safe against severe flooding. It was a wide, corrugated steel chute that fed directly out into the deep ravine bordering the back edge of the property. I reached the heavy iron grate covering the drain and pulled it open with my bleeding hands. The opening was tight, but my survival instinct overrode the physical pain. I squeezed my shoulders into the freezing steel pipe, letting the rushing water carry me forward. I slid through the dark, suffocating tube for what felt like an eternity, the cold metal scraping against my torn clothes until I was expelled out the other side. I tumbled down a steep, snow-covered embankment, landing heavily in a thick, freezing snowdrift. I laid there for a moment, staring up at the dark, swirling sky, taking deep, desperate gasps of the crisp, clean winter air. I was alive. I rolled onto my side and pushed myself up into a kneeling position, the howling blizzard immediately biting into my soaked clothes. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat. Before leaving the storage facility, when the distracted young security guard had turned his back to press the manual override, I had slipped his smartphone off the reception desk. It was a petty theft, but I knew I would need an untraceable lifeline. I pulled the phone out now, shielding the glowing screen from the driving snow. My fingers were numb, shaking violently as I swiped the screen open. I pulled the small yellow sticky note from my pocket, glancing at the phone number Martha had written down in her journal. I punched in the digits for Special Agent Harrison of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The line rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. I did not waste time with introductions. I told him I was Richard Alden, the husband of Martha Alden. I told him I had the digital files, the audio recordings, and the physical location of a high-level cartel money laundering exchange happening right this second. I gave him my exact address and told him the entire house was rigged to explode with raw gas. Harrison did not ask a single unnecessary question. He told me to stay down and keep out of sight. I dragged myself up the steep embankment and found a vantage point behind a massive oak tree, giving me a clear view of the sprawling estate. The heavy steel hurricane shutters covered every window and door, transforming my home into a blind, impenetrable bunker. Inside, the panic must have been absolute. They were trapped with a ticking time bomb. I huddled in the freezing snow, shivering, watching the silent driveway. Less than 10 minutes later, the dark street erupted into a blinding sea of flashing red and blue lights. Black armored vehicles and unmarked tactical SUVs tore through the heavy iron gates, skidding to a halt on the snow-covered lawn. Dozens of armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, carrying heavy breaching equipment and assault rifles. A massive armored truck backed up to the front porch. The tactical team attached heavy hydraulic winches to the steel hurricane shutters I had dropped over the main entrance. With a deafening screech of tearing metal, the hydraulics ripped the steel barrier out of the concrete foundation. The tactical units immediately flooded into the house, their flashlight beams cutting through the dark interior. I watched from the shadows as the chaotic raid unfolded. They must have shut off the main gas line from the street, preventing the catastrophic explosion. Within 5 minutes, the front door area was swarming with activity. The first person dragged out into the freezing snow was the cartel boss. He was thrown against the hood of an armored vehicle, his hands cuffed behind his back, surrounded by 6 agents with their rifles drawn. Behind him, stumbling into the harsh glare of the police spotlights, were Brooke and Derek. Brooke was crying hysterically, her expensive clothes torn, screaming at the agents that she was an innocent hostage. She was shoved into the back of a waiting cruiser, her desperate lies falling on deaf ears. Then came my son. Derek looked broken. The arrogant, untouchable financial genius was gone. He was pale, trembling, and gasping for air as 2 large federal agents dragged him down the front steps. His hands were shackled behind his back. I stepped out from behind the heavy oak tree and walked across the snow-covered lawn. The federal agents saw me approaching, but Special Agent Harrison stepped forward and raised a hand signaling them to let me pass. I stopped 3 feet away from Derek. He looked up at me, his bloodshot eyes widening in shock. He thought he had killed me. He thought I was dead in the flooded basement. "Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "Dad, please tell them. Tell them I had nothing to do with this. Tell them the cartel forced me. Please, you have to help me." I stood there looking at the miserable, treacherous creature shivering in the snow. I slowly reached into my left pocket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill Brooke had thrown at me earlier that afternoon. I let it flutter from my bleeding fingers, dropping it directly at his feet. "Keep it," I said, my voice cold and absolutely final. "You will need it for the vending machine in prison." I turned my back on him without waiting for a reply, walking over to the waiting ambulance where paramedics wrapped a thick thermal blanket around my freezing shoulders. I did not look back as the heavy doors of the federal transport van slammed shut, finally, severing the toxic bond between a father and the son who tried to destroy him. The next 6 months were an exhausting whirlwind of depositions, endless legal briefings, and harsh federal hearings. But I walked through that fire with my head held completely high. With the irrefutable evidence provided by Martha audio recordings and her meticulously detailed journal, the Federal Bureau of Investigation unraveled the entire criminal enterprise within a matter of weeks. The offshore cryptocurrency accounts were seized, the cartel operatives were systematically hunted down, and the shadow corporation bearing my name was completely dissolved. I was formally and entirely cleared of any wrongdoing by the United States Department of Justice. The heavy burden of a $6 million federal tax lien was erased from my record, and my frozen assets were fully restored. The trial was brief, brutally efficient, and entirely devoid of any family sympathy. Derek sat at the defense table looking hollow and defeated, his expensive tailored suits replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He tried to claim he was coerced by the cartel, but the digital trail he left behind proved he was the master architect of the money laundering operation. He also could not escape the damning evidence surrounding the night Martha died. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a man who would step over his own mother's dying body to protect his greed. Derek was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Brooke fared only slightly better. Her defense attorneys painted her as an ignorant spouse, but the evidence clearly showed she was a willing and active participant in the extortion and conspiracy. She wept bitterly as the judge handed down a mandatory sentence of 15 years behind bars. As the bailiff led them out of the courtroom, neither of them looked in my direction, and I felt nothing but a profound, absolute peace. The cancerous infection had been successfully cut out of my life forever. With my name cleared and the criminals permanently locked away, I had to decide what to do with the massive Denver estate. The sprawling $2 million house was no longer a home. It was a dark, hollow fortress built on lies tainted by the memory of betrayal and the horrific truth of my wife passing. I could not spend another night walking across the oak floors I had built, waiting for ghosts to speak. So I completely walked away from it. I contacted a reputable local charity that provided emergency housing and rehabilitation for battered families. I sold them the entire property, the land, the structure, and the custom furnishings for exactly one single penny. It was a symbolic transaction that washed my hands clean of the cursed real estate. Then I took my recovered financial assets, the money I had worked 40 grueling years to save, and I founded the Martha Alden Engineering Fund. My beautiful wife spent her entire life teaching children, believing deeply in their potential, even when the world ignored them. I wanted her name to be associated with hope, not tragedy. The foundation was designed exclusively to provide full academic scholarships and hands-on trade apprenticeships for underprivileged young men and women. We took kids who grew up with nothing, kids who were overlooked by society, and we taught them how to build things with their own two hands. We taught them the value of honest labor, the integrity of a hard day of work, and the absolute importance of character. Every time I signed a scholarship check bearing Martha's name, I felt a warm, comforting presence beside me. I knew she was smiling down proud that we were finally using our legacy to build up a new generation of builders, instead of hoarding it behind steel shutters and high-definition security cameras. I had successfully turned the darkest chapter of my entire existence into a beacon of light for others who desperately needed a helping hand. Today, my life looks completely different than I ever imagined it would at 70 years old. I am sitting behind the steering wheel of a comfortably worn recreational vehicle. The engine hums with a steady, reliable rhythm beneath my feet. I am driving west down a long, winding Colorado highway, heading toward the majestic silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. The late afternoon sun is slowly dipping below the jagged peaks, painting the vast sky in brilliant strokes of gold, fiery orange, and deep purple. The dashboard radio is playing a soft acoustic melody, and a fresh cup of dark roast coffee sits securely in the cup holder next to me. I am entirely alone in the cabin of the recreational vehicle, but for the first time in over 2 years, I do not feel lonely. I feel completely free. My dignity is fully intact, my conscience is entirely clear, and my heart is finally at peace. The heavy chains of betrayal and the suffocating weight of my son's dark ambition have been left miles behind me on the side of the road. I do not look in the rearview mirror anymore. I keep my eyes focused straight ahead on the open road, eagerly looking forward to whatever tomorrow might bring. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If my journey helped you find the courage to face your own family struggles, please consider sharing this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Did you enjoy this story of survival and ultimate justice? Please let me know exactly which city you are listening from in the comments down below. Do not forget to hit that subscribe button. See you in the next life story, with love and respect. Love and